Dragon Bond, Chapter 14. Zala kept her hand on the hilt of her sword as she led her team through the jungle, rain pattering onto the top of the canopy and dripping off the broad leaves and spattering the tops of their heads. 5 years ago, there had been villagers and plantations in this valley, farmers turning the lush earth into coffee, cocoa, citrus, and sugarcane. Under the dragon's influence, the land had gone back to wilderness, finding plants snaking across the ground and frond-filled shrubs growing higher than a man's head. There might still be food to be found. This was a haven of a predator now, of creatures that preferred meat to fruits and vegetables. Zala felt particularly disgruntled at the loss of the coffee bushes. She didn't make enough to pay exorbitant amounts for her addiction, and the army, not considering it a necessity, did not automatically include it with the troop rations. Monkeys howled in the treetops, and bats and birds flew for safe homes. She had grown up scarcely 100 miles from here in a similar environment, but the jungle felt wild and perilous now. It didn't help that her sword had been humming since before they had stepped out of the tunnels. "Trouble?" Colonel Sander asked, walking beside her. He could not have seen much in the fading twilight, but he nodded toward her waist, where her hand gripped her sword. "A lot of dragon activity. Those 4 flew off, but there are others within a mile." Zala kept her voice down, glancing back at her men. "I can feel them out there, too, even without a sword. Every time the monkeys go quiet, I hear the distant flap of wings." Sander pointed toward the dripping canopy. You can't see them, but they're up there." Zala nodded. "When I was here before, there weren't so many dragons around," he said. "We're near their seat of power, their king's home. Last time you were here, they didn't have a king yet, right?" "No, but their supreme commander held the mountain. This was still their seat of power." The monkeys fell quiet abruptly, and their team walked in silence, Zala eyeing the darkening shadows beneath the trees. She noticed Sander shooting glances at her. When the sound of nightlife returned, bugs buzzing and bats on the hunt flapping about, she spoke again. "Say what's on your mind, Sander." Zala expected a comment about that parting kiss Talon had given her, about receiving it in front of her entire team. Though she had been glad Talon had reassured her and had left the images of the mountain base in her mind, she would not have chosen such a public place for a tongue-tangling. She could only imagine what her people were thinking. Would they believe that Talon controlled her instead of the other way around? Would they lose all faith and trust in her and request transfers to other units when this was over? "The dragon. In our meeting, you said this was your idea." Sander waved in the direction they were heading, though the trees hid the mountain from view. "Yes." "Are you positive about that? That you brought it up first?" "Yes. Why do you ask?" "I can't help but think your prisoner might have manipulated things so that we came here where he could be captured. Why else would there be so many dragons about?" "Manipulated things?" He meant manipulated her, even if he did not say it so bluntly. Her cheeks flushed. "It could have nothing to do with us," Zala said. "For good or ill, I was the one to bring up this idea first." "And he went right along with it?" "No, he objected at first, but he wanted his freedom badly." "Listen, ma'am." "Zala." Sander rested his hand on her forearm briefly. "I'm not questioning your command abilities, or even the fact that we're out here risking our team without orders. The king usually goes along with whatever you decide to do anyway." He smiled. "I'm just concerned. I've known you for years, and in all that time, if you've ever had a sexual relationship with anybody, you've been so discreet that nobody would have guessed. You always seemed indifferent to the entire notion, too dedicated to protecting our people and killing dragons to notice a pretty face." "Not indifferent, just busy." And as she had grown older and acquired more wounds, of the body and of the soul, she had stopped believing that she could appeal to anyone. It had been easier to distance herself from the idea of romance than to risk rejection. "I know I'm the one who suggested seducing the dragon. I was joking, to be honest, and didn't think you'd even entertain the idea. But to see you actually affected by him, it's disconcerting, especially when you're not the only one. Jadskin and Selena both drool when he walks by. He clearly has some strange allure, and it's not your fault if you're taken in by it. But what if he was chosen for that? What if this is all a trap?" "Awfully elaborate just to catch a group of humans." "Humans with 2 storm swords, and with General Shalenor leading them. You've been a thorn under their claws for years. They'd love to see you dead. Something screeched over their heads, the foliage rattling. Zala was on the verge of dismissing it as some panther hunting in the treetops, a creature unlikely to target them, But then her sword pulsed, the vibrations coursing up her arm and through her body. "Dragon," she whispered, waving for her men to close in. Selena ran up to join her blade drawn, and the gray glow lighting the way ahead of her. Zala hoped the illumination would not be visible to any dragons flying above the canopy. "How many?" Sander asked. "I have no way to tell," Zala said. "That looks like a clearing up ahead, maybe a pond. Let's skirt it and stay in the trees, making it or them fight the vines and branches to get to us." Agreed. A figure ran out of the darkness up ahead. Vorkon. "Dragons?" Zala asked. "Yes, but we're close to Mount Slash, too," Vorkon said, wiping sweat and rain from his face. He took deep breaths. "I saw 2 dragons circling over that pond up there, but if we run, we might make it to the tunnels before they can find us." "There aren't tunnels," Sanders said, "according to our former prisoner." He frowned. "Just rubble that we have to dig through. If we can't get through it quickly, that won't be a good place to make a stand." "Let's at least try to get close," Zala said. By that point, the rest of her team had gathered around her. "Who's up for a run?" "A run from a dragon or a calm jog through the evening air, ma'am?" "Whatever will make you fast, Jasher," she said. "Fast? Jash? I always figured he was in the unit to be the rear bait so the rest of us could escape." "Quiet, Carver. I could throw you into that pond up there and we'd see who was the bait. You'd have to catch me first." Zala held up a hand. "Quiet. We've got company up there. No time for chatter. Come on. Vorkon's leading and we're going on a jog." "Yes, ma'am," the men responded together. Zala waited for Vorkon to lead. "Selena, follow him. I'll take the rear this time." Selena hesitated. "Are you sure, ma'am?" "Yes." Any aerial assailant would likely swoop down on them from behind. Zala did not believe Talon had sent her team into a trap. She knew very well that she had chosen this all by herself, but if she had timed this mission poorly, then she should take the largest risk. Perhaps she should have done as Sander had suggested and taken Talon back to the king to propose this mission to him instead of taking it upon herself to undertake it. The king might have said no, but he might have sent a scouting team ahead of time, too, so they could have chosen the right night to approach. But she had not been comfortable with the idea of keeping Talon as a prisoner indefinitely, or handing his fate over to someone else. She ran after the rest of her team, her sword alternating between humming angrily and pulsing warnings. In the increasing darkness, roots tripped her, and the thorny vines scraped at her clothing and gear, but she kept up. They reached the pond and skirted it as she had instructed. Above the water, the canopy broke, revealing dark, heavy clouds in the night sky. Rain pattered onto the water's surface, and frogs croaked. If there were dragons flying up there, she couldn't see them. The jolt her sword sent up her arm was the only warning she had of the attack. "Dragon," she called, as she whirled, thrusting the blade and drawing it. A huge dark shape plummeted toward her. She held her position for several long seconds, wanting the creature to believe she meant to meet it head-on, that she wouldn't spring away. Meanwhile, she used her peripheral vision to examine the adjacent terrain. At the last second, she dove to the side, avoiding claws that swept along the trail, inches above the earth. She rolled behind a tree and jumped to her feet. The dragon had already cruised past and was rising again, but the jungle limited its maneuverability. It gained altitude, but not quickly. It had to duck massive branches that even a dragon could not fly straight through and snap off. Zala ran up the trail, almost crashing into Selena, who was on her way back. She veered to the side, leapt into a tree, and raced out on a thick limb. The dragon was banking, coming back in for another attack. It had to fly around a copse of thick trees, and Zala couldn't see it for a moment. It shouldn't be able to see her either. She sheathed her sword so the glow would not give away her position, and scrambled higher into the tree. Sanders' voice drifted down the trail as he barked quiet orders, urging the men into the woods for cover. Several bows twanged, arrows flying into the darkness, so long as they did not fly toward Zala. The dragon streaked out of the dark canopy, angling not toward her but toward Selena and the trail. It might not realize that its original target had moved. That would be ideal. Zala froze on the branch, one hand grasping a vine and one on the hilt of her sword, ready to draw it again. As the dragon flew closer, she crouched. Her timing would have to be precise. "Not yet. Not yet. Now," she whispered, and jumped off the branch, drawing her blade at the same time. She landed lower on the dragon's back than she had hoped, but she twisted and scrambled up it quickly. The slick scales offered little in the way of toe holds, but as she'd long ago learned, momentum could take a person to impossible places. She made it to the dragon's neck before losing her balance. She dropped, wrapping her legs and one arm around the sinewy neck. The creature had been shooting straight for Selena, but she had disappeared from the trail. Recognizing the new threat, it whirled and bucked, trying to hurl Zala off. She hung on like a tick and slashed into the side of its neck, shearing off scales. "More coming, General," came someone's yell from up the path. Zala, feeling an increased urgency, hacked at the dragon's neck. Between the creature whipping its head around and her tenuous position, she struggled to find the leverage she needed to land a killing blow. She thought about loosening her grip and trying to climb higher, but the dragon landed and reared up on its hind legs first. It tucked in its wings and backed towards a tree, quickly. It almost succeeded in smashing Zala into that tree. Spotting the branches, she loosened her grip enough to slide around to the underside of the dragon's neck. One of her knees crashed against the trunk, pain surging through her body. Still, she kept her grip and jammed her sword into the bottom of the dragon's throat. A clawed limb swiped toward her. She couldn't dodge while she hung, so she was forced to let go. The claws came so close, they batted at her braid. She'd hoped she hadn't just lost half of her hair. In danger of being trampled, Zala should have run off into the woods as soon as she landed. Instead, ignoring the pain in her knee, she raced straight between the dragon's legs. All four of them were on the ground, so she could reach the paler scale of its belly. She sprinted in close and rammed the sword upward. Her move was almost too late. The fanged maw snapped right behind her, so close that she lost a piece of her uniform jacket. But the point of her blade slid between the two scales, giving the dragon something else to worry about. It leapt straight up like a startled cat. One of its back paws struck her in the shoulder as it passed, the weight of the blow hurling her to the ground. Afraid the dragon would land right back on her, Zala rolled into the soggy ferns and thorny bushes next to the trail. Foliage clawed at her, keeping her from rolling as far as she wanted. The dragon did indeed land again, its head now pointing straight at her. Zala sprang up, wincing at the throbbing of her knee, and lifted her sword as the maw came toward her, jaws snapping once again. There wasn't time or room to dodge. She thrust her blade straight between the dragon's jaws, piercing the roof of its mouth, even as hot, meat-drenched breath struck her. The head whipped up, and her heart lurched as her sword was torn from her grip. She stumbled backward, weaponless. The dragon was too busy shaking its head around to take advantage of her state. To her surprise, that massive head cracked against a tree, and then against another one. "Selena?" Zala risked calling out, trying to glimpse the rest of her people as she watched the dragon in case it attacked her again. "Sander?" Someone shouted from farther up the trail, and she glimpsed Selena atop a second dragon's back, trying to find her way to its throat, but a great thrashing and snapping of wood in the opposite direction drowned out the reports people might have been making. A new dragon landed, not 10 meters from her. "Shouldn't have complained about the coffee bushes," she muttered. The gods were not pleased with her. The dragon with her sword in its mouth stumbled and fell to the ground, its legs collapsing. Had she managed to sink her blade in deeply enough to pierce its brain from below? A question to be answered later. The new dragon's eyes flared an eerie pale blue, and it leaped toward her, clearly willing to go through its comrade to reach her. Zala sprinted around the fallen dragon, using it for cover. Though it still twitched in its death throes, its wings battering the foliage with enough power to knock over a human. She had to risk running under them, not only to avoid the other one, but because she needed her sword. Without it, all she could do was duck and dodge. A screech sounded, one she feared would alert every dragon in the valley that intruders had come. Zala reached the maw of the fallen dragon and found its eyes open and glaring, tracking her. She flinched, having expected it to be dead, mostly dead. To stick her hand into the maw of a still living dragon, that could be suicide, but she needed her sword. The new dragon leaped onto its comrade's back, its wings stretched, and its eyes flaring that pale blue light as they bored into her. There wasn't time to try for the sword. She dove back under the dying dragon's wing, hoping it would be enough to protect her from an attack from the other. She expected to hear the snap of fangs right behind her, but instead something jostled the bottom dragon's body. Its side heaved, half knocking her over, and the wing almost smothered her. Her first thought was that the creature had more life in it and was rising again. That filled her with terror because she might lose her sword if it flew away, and because her people might not be able to handle 3 dragons. But then snaps and screeches and thumps shook the air above her and the body beside her. Confused, she half ran and half crawled out from underneath the wing. She raced to the closest tree and used it for cover as she peeked back toward the trail. A 4th dragon had entered the fray. Before her terror could reach a new level, she realized the new dragon was attacking the one that had been about to eat her. "Talon?" she whispered. Each dragon had its fangs sunken into the other's flesh, and they fought with claws and wings. They rolled off the downed dragon, entwined like wrestlers. Zala hoped Talon was indeed helping them, but she couldn't count on him to solve their entire problem. She ran back to the head of the fallen dragon. Its eyes were still open, but the light in them had gone out, and it had stopped moving. Though her heart slammed into her ribcage, she risked leaning far into the creature's maw, sticking her arm and shoulder past that fence of killer fangs. She had to touch the moist, hot tongue in order to grab the hilt of her blade. "You'll get a good bath later," she told it as she tugged at the hilt. The blade resisted her tugs, and she hissed in frustration. It must have cut into a foot of flesh and brain matter. She had to climb entirely into the thing's maw to find a better grip. Finally, she wrenched the blade free, but the dragon's upper jaw crashed down. Cursing, she thrust her arm up to keep her from being trapped inside. The weight dropped her to her knees. She hacked at the fangs, struggling to create an opening for herself. When she finally escaped, rolling free of her saliva-filled prison, she collapsed on the ground, feeling as if that might have been a battle in its own right. The jungle had grown quiet, deathly quiet. She forced herself to her feet, her sword clenched in her grip. Her people couldn't have fallen, not that quickly. A dragon head reared up from behind the ridge of the fallen creature's spine. Zala jumped back, raising her blade, ignoring the saliva and blood that flew from it. The eyes that flashed at her were violet, familiar. "Talon?" she asked warily, not lowering the blade. She glanced down the trail, trying to see her people. Another dragon body lay in the foliage up ahead. It wasn't moving. Good. "Yes. Did your mother never tell you not to climb into a dragon's mouth?" She forgot to mention it, probably because there weren't dragons infiltrating our world then. Talon's head disappeared. Had he shapeshifted? Zala walked around the fallen dragon to look for him, but also so she could head up the trail to find the others. A naked human man walked out of the ferns. "Infiltrated?" Talon sounded remorseful. "I suppose to you our great escape from victimization must seem that way. If you hadn't victimized us when you arrived, perhaps we would have felt differently." Zala spotted the other dragon, the one he had been battling. Its broken body lay crumpled against the trees several meters from the path. "I do appreciate your help with that." "Good." He walked beside her, brushing her lower back with his hand for a moment. She was tempted to lean against him. That battle had not been her most graceful, and her legs felt weak after having to cut herself out of a dead dragon's mouth. Somehow that had left her more fraught than dealing with the living ones. She glimpsed light ahead, however, and only patted his arm. It was the gray light of Selena's sword, and other figures moved about nearby. "General?" came Sanders' shaken voice from up the trail. "Was that your dragon?" Zala had sheathed her sword. He must not be able to see her walking up with Talon at her side. "My dragon. It's Talon. I don't think we've staked any claims of ownership on each other." "That kiss said otherwise," someone muttered. "I can be your dragon," Talon spoke into her mind. "We must hurry. I can sense others out there." "I know. I can too," she said softly, not certain if he would hear her if she thought her responses, and not certain how comfortable she was with the idea of him being able to see into her mind. "Only when we're close." He looked toward her. "I can stay out if you wish." "Let me think about it," she thought experimentally, and glanced over to see if he had understood. He nodded once. "Will there be serious repercussions for the choice you've made? To help us?" "Only if they catch me." "Let's try to avoid that, then." "An agreeable idea." She had never asked him to fight on her people's behalf, and she worried that he had just condemned himself, and that he would never be able to return to his kind. Just because Talon hadn't gotten along with the Dragon King and had been imprisoned did not mean he had no other friends among his kind. Would any of them understand his choice? Why he had killed dragons to help humans? No, came the soft thought in her mind, the single word edged with sorrow. Zala hoped that sorrow would not turn to regret one day, that he would not come to resent her. I made my decision before I'd ever met you in person, only from a distance in battle. Not enough of a distance, she thought, touching an old scar on her shoulder for which he had been responsible. You gave me scars, too. His tone seemed lighter, and he bumped her arm with his. I could show you sometime. One is in quite a private area. You almost rendered me incapable of mating. I didn't notice any scars in that particular area when I was inspecting it. I'll have to show you in my true form. I have different scars than the ones I received as a human. He cleared his throat in her mind. Oh, and inspecting? Was that what you were doing? It was an oddly pleasurable inspection. Her cheeks flushed. They were joining the others, and this was hardly the time for thinking about inspections. Any injuries? Zala asked, trying to identify everyone by the light of her and Selena's swords. Yes, Sanders said, pointing to one of the men. Their medical officer, Lieutenant Elia, was bandaging his leg. No deaths, ma'am, she said. But Hasten lost a lot of blood and won't be able to walk. Her grim tone said that walking might not be the worst of the soldier's problems. Leave me here, ma'am, Hasten said. I'll be no good to you. We'll carry you to the tunnels, see if we can find a safe spot where you can wait, Zala said. There are too many dragons out to leave you here. Talon, do you have any idea of what's going on? Were they all here for you? It would seem unlikely, but no, I don't have any information about what my kind are doing these days. He shifted his shoulders in a gesture that was almost human, but not quite. It's been a year since anyone reported in to me, except... He hesitated. The dragon who helped you in our camp? Zala guessed. Yes, but he didn't have much time to give me details on much. He lowered his voice to a whisper. I'm not sure he survived. Sorry. Zala gripped his arm. Her sword buzzed on her hip. More dragons approaching, she said. Sander cursed. As soon as they figure out to attack en masse, we're dead. General, I hate to say it, but we need to abort. There will be even more dragons in Mount Slash. This is turning into a suicide mission. Zala held up a hand. Talon, are they sensing you, or our swords? Most likely me. They may not have figured out yet that you're here. They could only know that they've got a dragon who's gone rogue. That's what they'll consider it. What if you flew off, taking Corporal Hasten with you, and dropped him off somewhere safe, then stayed away until things settled down? His eyes flared with inner fire. You wish me to leave you without protection? We won't need as much protection if the dragons don't know exactly where we are, Zala said. We have our own protection. Selena touched her sword, an indignant expression on her face. I wouldn't mind the dragon's help, Sanders said, a surprising backer. I'm going off with a dragon? Hasten looked up from his leg, his eyes round. Lead them away. Zala grasped Talon's arm again. Please. I never meant for you to be a part of this infiltration, to attack your own people. My kind will still be able to sense you through your swords, Talon said. We'll risk it. We'll hope they think that trouble is left with your departure, especially if they see a human riding on your back. Talon sighed into her mind. Your soldier is not who I wanted to give a ride to. I know. I would very much like that ride if it's still being offered later. He rested a hand against the side of her face as he gazed into her eyes. Only for you. Zala wanted to lean into his touch, to forget this mission she had created for herself, especially when the dragons were on high alert already. What if she didn't survive? What if he didn't? Thank you, she whispered, then made herself back away from him. She had work to do.